This is a journey to Taiwan. Known officially as the Republic of China, it used to be called Ilha Formosa, which means beautiful island, a name coined by Portuguese explorers who set sight on its striking landscape in the 1500s. The pod-shaped island lies at a Pacific juncture between China, Japan, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, giving it strategic and commercial importance. The Tropic of Cancer cuts across its belly. A jagged backbone of forested mountains and steep valleys runs its length from semi-tropical north to lush south. This place has been woven in and out of my life for the past 50 years. My name is Neal E. Robbins, and I am a journalist. I first lived in Taiwan in the 1970s to learn Chinese. I came back in the 1990s as a journalism professor. I've come back now because the island is at a geopolitical crossroads. Taiwan is run like a nation, but it is not widely recognized as a sovereign state because China claims ownership of Taiwan. It's often framed as though its disputed status and the sharpening conflict this has given rise to is the only thing that matters to people here. But in fact, it's a place like any other place, a place where people live, one with its own rich history. Home to indigenous peoples, Taiwan has been populated over recent centuries by Chinese immigrants and was also a Japanese colony for 50 years. Now, it is a multi-ethnic community of 23 million people. More than a land in limbo, it's a mover and shaker. Taiwan has taken charge of its fate, building on a miracle growth spurt with economic and social footwork, and by creating a democracy that in the space of a few decades has become one of the most free and liberal societies on earth. I feel the time has come to see Taiwan through its own eyes, to look into those things that matter to its people, the island's dark legacies, questions over the evolving Taiwanese national identity, and hopes and dreams that bind Taiwan and China together in contrary ways, even as China threatens violence if Taiwan continues to reject Beijing's claims on the island. To glimpse people's hearts and minds and see the world from Taiwan's viewpoint, I will crisscross this roughly Switzerland-sized island over 6 months, interviewing people as I meet them. My travels begin one morning in Taipei, the capital city, at the back of a 7th grade class.
Today we're at Longmen Junior High School to learn about history. 那你自己在小学学习历史就学到是内容是什么？
我自己吗？我这个年代的人在小学、中学、国中、高中学校里面都是没有台湾史的。
Until the 1990s, only Chinese history was taught. Today, the history of Taiwan is a key subject. She's teaching the students how Taiwan's fate in the 19th century hinged on the weakness of China's Qing dynasty.
对中国进行了英法联军，好，那一个英国都没有办法打过，更何况是英国和法国联合，对不对？
In 1895, in the back-and-forth power trading of the imperialist age, the Chinese emperor handed Taiwan and its associated islets over to Japan. It ruled over its colonial subjects, imposing Japanese language and culture until 1945. When Japan was defeated in World War II, control of Taiwan passed to the Republic of China, or ROC, successor to the Qing dynasty in China. The ROC government was run by the Chinese Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang. In 1949, the Republic of China lost the civil war with the Communists, who set up the People's Republic of China, or PRC, on the mainland. The Kuomintang regime, with its leader Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan, believing the island would be a temporary stopover before it returned to the mainland to topple the Communists and retake power in all of China.
因为他总觉得他是一个少数的外来统治者，他对台湾本地的人呢，就是要提防，怕台湾本地的人反抗他。
Having fought with Japanese invaders during the internecine struggle for power in China, Chiang was suspicious of the Taiwanese, fearing their loyalties had changed after the decades of Japanese rule. Taiwanese had hoped the Kuomintang, also known as the KMT, would again make them first-class citizens in their own land. But in 1947, a dispute with a cigarette smuggler on a Taipei street was used as a pretext for a ruthless crackdown by the KMT on potential opposition. The rampage, which came to be known as the February 28th incident, left 18,000 to 28,000 people dead, wiping out an entire generation of elites. This dashed hopes for a Taiwanese resurgence. Chiang later imposed a harsh martial law, which marked the beginning of decades of oppression known as the White Terror. The KMT, ambivalently backed by the U.S. as a bulwark against communism, pushed a Chiang personality cult, authoritarian rule, and what it called thought reform and education, forcing another remolding on the people.
所以他说：“哎，我们都是皇帝的子孙啊。”
With this refrain endlessly repeated, schools imposed Mandarin Chinese, forcing pupils who spoke Japanese or local languages to wear a sign. Textbooks adopted the KMT's version of history, focusing on the unity of China, its 5,000 years of history, and the rise of the Republic of China and how it claimed rights over all of China, not just Taiwan. It was a cultural counterpart to the White Terror's brute force, much of which was delivered at this former military court and prison, now the National Human Rights Museum.
During the White Terror period, the Taiwanese government, the Republic of China government, used this excuse, national security, to systematically oppress any political dissidents.
The regime jailed some 140,000 and executed 3,000 to 4,000 for alleged political crimes. The attitude was to arrest or kill 1,000 so as not to miss the one who was guilty. So among the alleged communists and Taiwan independence supporters named at this memorial, many swept into the system had done nothing at all. We went to the court-martial room.
This is where the defendants stand. And
You would stand right here.
stand right here. And this is their verdict. Once it's finalized, this is also where they sign the verdicts. And this is the confession by one of our former political prisoners.
Confession.
Yes.
When I realized I was standing where countless had heard that they would rot in jail or be executed, their fate often hanging on a forced confession, I had a sinking feeling. The prison was a grim, grim place with horrible overcrowding, miserable rations, poor hygiene, mental torture, and chained prisoners. But a courtroom here is also linked to the demise of the regime and the birth of democracy. It was where leaders of the 1979 protests in the southwestern city of Kaohsiung were put on trial for 9 grueling days. Taiwan's government was then under Chiang's son, Chiang Jing-kuo, who had headed the secret police. He was under U.S. pressure to ease repression, so the political defendants demanding democracy were allowed to have open trials.
For the first time in decades, people of Taiwan could read with their own eyes about what actually happened. For the first time, they could understand why these rioters did what they did. And people started questioning because apparently they were not as described by the government.
From that point, momentum built for democracy. Chiang Jing-kuo ended martial law in 1987, removing the main barrier to change. It ended fully in 1991 when laws outlawing freedom of expression were finally dropped. Today, the crimes of the past have only been partly reckoned with via a process known as transitional justice, compensating victims. So tensions still run high, but the end of martial law, among the longest on record, opened a new era.
台湾的这个1990的这个变化，简单来说，台湾的变化主要有2个，一个呢是自由化、民主化，政治就是把戒严的这个去除掉，要自由化、民主化；另外一个就是本土化。1990开始，大家逐渐的在思考， 我是哪里人？ 我是哪一国的人，我是什么人，我是中国人还是台湾人，或者我既是中国人也是台湾人，这是90年代的一个大的问题嘛。
That crisis was addressed in part through education. Li Denghui, the first Taiwan-born president, ushered in full democracy, winning the first free elections in 1996. He had school texts revised, focusing on Taiwan rather than China. Du later oversaw further textbook revisions. So how do kids see themselves today?
当然，这几代的小孩，他们从小就接触台湾史，可能我觉得他们的确可能会比较以台湾为中心思考周遭的事情。
That's a big change. Today, many forces shape children's thinking, but among them, school texts stand out.
我们就开始改变这个结构。但这个结构呢，它变成一个浮动性的，也就是说，我们希望在课程的规划里面，不再就是很明确的台湾史、中国史、世界史，而是这3个地区能够互动，能够浮动的，能够调整，然后希望能够让学生能够有一个比较系统性的一个思考，那也可以能够解决未来的问题。同样，我们也希望。因为全球关联嘛，我们也希望他们也是多元的思考，那能够有一些对国际的一些理解，这样子。
所以我觉得这是很大的不一样。那还有一个很大的不同是，我觉得这次我们还有把那个特别会比较强调原住民族的一些观点放进来，这是以前不会强调的。
She is talking about the original Austronesian inhabitants of Taiwan, whose ancestors came to the island thousands of years ago. The colonial period also gets a more balanced treatment, weighing up Japan's industrial contribution to Taiwan, along with oppression it imposed. The ways Korea, Japan, and Vietnam looked at China are also compared. With changes such as these, Taiwan's children are putting 2 and 2 together.
就是小孩子在2000年前出生跟2000年后出生，这个孩子是不一样的。我们过去是期待小孩子乖乖的，老师教什么你就听什么，你就学什么。但2000年后，我们要孩子的是你要慢慢的勇于发表，要有思考能力，而不是只是背，不是只有升学考试。所以这样的一个发展趋势下来，对孩子的认同慢慢有一些独立的想法。所以我想。像教科书的改变，学校教育的改变，相对对他们来讲，对他们的自己的认同，他们慢慢会去摸索，他们也慢慢能够理解为什么老是我们奥运我们都拿不出国旗来，为什么我们这个出去有很多国家不承认。
In 1971, the government of the Republic of China on Taiwan, the ROC, lost its seat as a representative of China in the United Nations to the People's Republic of China, the PRC. Ambiguity in past agreements over Taiwan's international standing still clouds its national status. But the PRC has adopted a One China principle, casting Taiwan as an inalienable part of China. So Beijing insists Taiwan may only take part in the Olympics under the odd name Chinese Taipei, and it bans use of the ROC flag.
他慢慢从不理解，慢慢从教育的过程当中，慢慢能够理解，能够比较宽容去对待了。那我想台湾的孩子这几年来勇敢的走出去。
2页的台湾地图。
According to these educationalists, people say the new generation seem, in their words, naturally Taiwanese. More is happening. Educating children to think for themselves. What could be more radical? This caught my eye. Dancers are trying out all the latest moves in the Brazilian capoeira, popular in Taiwan, where people are eager to learn styles from all over. The National Taiwan History Museum in the southwestern city of Tainan sets out the past in a whirl of life-size dioramas. I talked with its Harvard-educated director.
I think there are 2 major features in Taiwanese history. One is that it's actually originally indigenous Aboriginal island, but the history was shaped by different waves of immigration. So it's actually an immigrant society, and that gradually different people come at different times and gradually become, right now we have different major ethnic groups, so it's a multi-ethnic society. On the other hand, it's also witnessed a lot of different colonial experiences. So we witnessed like 4 to 6 different regimes in a very short span of 400 or 500 years.
He described the museum as like the National Museum in the Southeast Asian state of Singapore, in that both museums are about everyday life of ordinary people, but with a critical difference.
Singapore doesn't really has any national identity questions. They are a full-fledged nation state or city states and recognized by the international society. In Taiwan, it is still an unresolved question whether you call yourself a Taiwanese or Chinese. Although we all have the same national identity card and passport, but people have different identity regarding, for example, the Republic of China, or there's some kind of imagined Republic of Taiwan in the future, or maybe a future reunion or like with the PRC. So it is still a very politically divided situation right now.
He said the different historical memories of the various generations mattered. This is a family tree. The indigenous peoples, residents of Taiwan for thousands of years, represent just over 2% of the population. The Hakka and Huklo, who make up about 15 and almost 70% respectively, both migrated to Taiwan from China in recent centuries. These early Han immigrants are collectively known as born in the province, or Banshangren. When in 1949, 2 million or so soldiers and civilians fled civil war in China, taking refuge in Taiwan, they and their Taiwan-born offspring came to be known as born outside the province, or Waishengren. Today they make up 13 to 14% of the population.
战后国民党来的时候，外省人的位阶被认为是高于本省人。本省人内部呢，可能福佬人跟客家人大概没有太大的差别，但是他们被认为是比原住民位阶来得高。
But the balance began to tip when a new generation born in Taiwan came of age in the 1970s and 80s.
战后这个新的世代，在接受国民党的这个教育下，已经成长了。他们学习了中国的语言，也学习了中国的文化，也开始认同自己是中国人，也学会了这个中国的语言跟文化之后，他们开始会觉得说，既然我们都已经在文化上那么相近，他希望能够有更平等的这个政治参与的权利。
When Taiwan lost UN recognition, it began dawning on everyone that reconquering China was not on the cards. Taiwan was on its own. Growing Taiwan nationalism forced KMT concessions. Meanwhile, time and intermarriage blurred lines.
但是到1990年代，特别是2000年以后，当中国崛起，然后开始展现他要并吞台湾，台湾民族主义在1990年代以后就变成是要反抗中国的这种扩张跟统一的这个论述，所以他在内容上就慢慢开始想要凝聚台湾内部所有的人去对抗中国。
There was a dramatic change in national identity. President Lee encouraged everyone to think of themselves as Taiwanese. Taiwaneseness, he said, was based not on origins, but on a common belief in freedom and democracy. In the 1990s, a quarter considered themselves Chinese. Even fewer felt just Taiwanese. By 2023, over 60% thought of themselves as Taiwanese, and most of the rest felt both Chinese and Taiwanese. Only a tiny percentage now think of themselves as just Chinese. To find out what might be happening, I met co-founders of the computer game firm Red Candle. Their horror-themed games, detention, and devotion, plus movie adaptations, have made them cultural pioneers. Coffee is 43 years old.
其实我觉得这个东西是很自然而然形成的，就是说，因为我小时候我就是在那个台北出生，那我就想说台北就台湾，那我就是台湾人。确实啦，我觉得台湾因为在国际上有一个比较特别的那个状态，你也会问我们这样认同的问题。当然我觉得这可能也是算台湾人的一种独特困扰吧。跟我自身有关的话，那个就可能已经是那种200年前祖先来，甚至300年前、400年前那个我们也是跟台湾本地的这个原住民，我们有融合过。然后其实我就是一个很有南岛特征的人，我皮肤比较偏黑，然后我有那个双眼皮或什么，这个特征其实是那个平埔族的特征。
Dong Dong, who's 41, feels his identity encompasses pride in Taiwan's democracy.
其实我们从小接受到的那个教育内容，其实都一直在强调我们是中国人，中国人。虽然到最后他会说，你是中华民国人这样，就是在40年，就是在20岁之后，就是脱离了就是那种义务教育的阶段之后，事实上我们会看到更多就是社会上面的真实状况。事实上，就算是在我人生的前20年。我认同的东西，它可能也不是中国，而是台湾在这一块土地上面发生的事情，跟我被灌输的东西，对，只是那个时候我们称之为中国，所以我认为我们认同的东西一直都没变，只是在名词上它发生了一个断代，就是说代表中国的这2个字，从我们熟悉的这个东西变成了隔壁邻居的状态，所以这很尴尬。我们其实我觉得变的不是我们，变的是这个世界对中国这2个字的定义在变。对。
Heroes change too. As Chiang Kai-shek's memory is questioned, many of his statues have been relegated to this park in Taoyuan. In a compromise to sensitivities, the likenesses are displayed without comment as to why they were abandoned.
You see, in my generation, I grew up considering myself Chinese, and we would be reunited with Chinese one day. Don't know how. That's how I felt before I was 30.
She was describing her experiences as a third-generation Waishengren. What she said reminded me of the posters and images expressing the mood of days gone by.
I started to have an interest in the history of Taiwan that I've never known throughout my years in school. Then I learned. Then I considered myself more Taiwanese. I started to have a stronger and stronger feeling that reunited or not, I like the way we live in Taiwan. I don't want to be governed by a political organization like CCP. I don't like how they...
Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah. And in my family, because I'm the oldest one of my generation, I tend to have the opportunity to exchange ideas with my parents' generation, who strongly believe in the greatness of Changjingguo, who strongly believe that China is a big, great country. They often overlook, say, concentration camp in Xinjiang and what they did to people in Hong Kong and the environmental pollution, etc. This is something they don't talk about. 10 years ago, I would try to see if I can change their ideas. But I don't do that anymore because it's hard. It's their value. So if I were to change their ideas, it means that they have to throw away what they've believed in for 70 years. And that would be too much lift for them. you'll be harsh.
I heard from a member of that earlier generation. This 73-year-old Taiwanese-born painter interprets landscape. We stand in his studio in Hualien on the East Coast. These are the traditional techniques of Chinese landscape painters. So are his paintings Chinese or Taiwanese?
我觉得是有中国绘画的精神，但是呢，真正我画的内涵是我觉得是比较属于台湾的一种景象在里边。因为教育的关系，以前的我们读的历史、读的地理都是以传统的中国教育为主。那我觉得那个部分没办法改变了，至少你的文字是一样的，对不对？那你读的那些传统的那些书是一样的，所以这个中国的这个部分其实是很根深蒂固的。对，我是1950年生，所以我想这个部分是改变不了的。
But his greatest influence was his painting teacher, who is trained in China in the long traditions of Chinese art and came to Taiwan in 1949.
台湾其实1949年以后，台湾其实收到一份很大的一个礼物。这个礼物呢，就是因为有国民党跟共产党的战争，很多大陆的人跑到台湾来，军人当然是其中的一部分，很多文学家、很多教授、很多学者、很多艺术家也跑来台湾。像我的老师来台湾很年轻，25岁，政治我不懂。但是绘画艺术我知道，如果我的老师没有经过那个训练，他不可能有今天的成就，我们也不可能跟他学到很多东西。但是这些东西到我们身上，我们已经把它转化成台湾的东西。
I found set-piece selfies have their own character in Taiwan. Typical scenes include showy backgrounds festooned with pastel flowers, thousands of Christmas lights, and of course, big smiles. When Lai Ching-sung returned to the land near Yilan to live off it, to heal it, and to be linked to urban life, he started a trend. This couple left Taipei to plant rice with him and open a restaurant. Huang Zixuan had been working 16-hour days as an architect.
我在骑机车的时候，然后我只有一点点我自己的，回到我自己的那个时候，我常常会去想，为什么我要过这样子的生活？没有不快乐，其实还蛮快乐的。可是我的整个人会一直在这个状态里面，我没有办法想象我50岁、60岁的时候，我还在那个城市里面过这样的生活。我又在大都市工作，你是被推着走的，你的自主权很少。那回来家乡的最大的优点，就是你可以慢慢去调整你自己的这个流，然后回到你最舒服的状态。我觉得我以前在工作的时候，那个平衡是完全没有的。
To understand the situation, you first need to know how Taiwan, a war-ravaged rural backwater after World War II, got rich. I went to talk to an expert in East Asian tigers to find out how that economic miracle in the 1950s to the 1990s moved Taiwan at double speed from poor to rich, such that now it ranks 22nd among world economies. It has relatively low income disparity, universal health systems, good public safety, excellent education, and low crime. The standard Taiwan get-rich story focuses on how the post-war KMT, building on infrastructure from the Japanese colonial period, pressed by conflict with China, boosted by U.S. Cold War cash, and driven by a long-hours Asian work ethic, pursued growth through exports, starting with simple stuff like farm products and then gradually substituting clothes, electronics, and high-tech. The story needs a little revising.
It's always a little bit contentious in giving the role of giving the credit to the role of the state.
She pointed out how the KMT, coming from the outside, was wary of large local capitalists. It focused on small and middle-sized companies because Japanese colonial and later KMT land-to-the-tiller reforms encouraged a proliferation of unthreatening, tiny, family-run enterprises. The KMT state provided the quality control these firms needed to compete in foreign markets. Bicycle manufacturers and assemblers are a case in point.
So it's very decentralized, and they all cluster in a geographical locale, for example, in central Taiwan. And people used to just say that about their relationship, they are all friends, or the trust among them allowed to make this kind of network production work.
This created a business ecosystem with a few big companies and lots of modestly sized ones. Entrepreneurs built on the culture of trust and family bonds. Foreign companies with a lot to lose are willing to share their trade secrets with Taiwanese partners, setting Taiwan apart from, say, China, where trust and indeed the rule of law is less a feature of society.
Taiwan has a lot of what we call hidden champions. They're very good at what they do, and they're world players, but you don't know who they are.
Tesla, she noted, worked with partners in Taiwan to make its first electronic car. They helped to turn the U.S. firm's idea into a product. The bicycle industry and high-tech, like semiconductors, what most people know as computer chips, work that way too, and use decentralized networks with global supply chains.
If you don't understand how production system organized in Taiwan, you won't be able to understand how the semiconductor industry operates in Taiwan. And the semiconductor industry in Taiwan is not just about TSMC. It's about the whole ecosystem.
TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, based in Hsinchu in western Taiwan, is the critical fabricator of 90% of the world's high-end computer chips and has become the crown jewel in Taiwan's economy, as well as a key part of the global economy. Taiwan's chip market is roughly twice the share of oil produced by OPEC. TSMC also represents the epitome of the long hours work culture in Taiwan, which has the 6th longest working day in the world. So what does all that have to do with urban exiles? Oddly, they both reflect the entrepreneurial spirit.
在新竹这个故事大家都讲，他们都过着看不到太阳的日子，很早就进工厂，下班的时候已经太阳下山了，所以他很有钱，但是他的生活难以想象，他们都会自己开玩笑所以他们花钱都花得很大方，因为除了这样子花钱之外，他没有办法感觉满足了。我们因为人变多嘛，所以我们
That kind of dilemma inspired Lai, who trained as an engineer and a lawyer. In 2004, he returned to his family roots on a farm, where he enjoys a rural life and grows rice organically, selling it online at a premium price. 20 years on, some 200 other formerly urban families have joined him in their new alternative-style Golden Rice Club. They live in nearby villages, often planting rice while working remotely.
那这是网络时代才产生的一个新的农村的样子，所以我们把自己当成是一个网络时代的实验，就是说，如果网络时代2000年嘛人类已经进入网络时代，那它改变了人类社会很多事情，那网络时代的农村会不会也出现一个很大的转变？它可能跟以前的农村不会一样，可是那应该会是长什么样子？我觉得我们这里有一点点是在做这个实验。
On the way to our next stop, our taxi driver was inspired by the sun on the grasses to sing us a song.
山风又冷了，芦花又开了，你应该会记得那去年的秋天。像炊烟在升起，像枫叶在飘落。
At the local village near Yilan, I talked with an 80-year-old who has helped the city slickers understand the village where he has lived his whole life. But he has also learned from them. He speaks Taiwanese Minnan, the Huklo language.
对啦，我拄啊讲不对，我是真正我是从事农业的。我都细汉出世，才出世。然后你就业的时嘛是做农，嘛是伫这所在。就是讲你讲起讲这农业有什么改变？
In his childhood, farming was all natural. The 1960s Green Revolution brought pesticides which boosted yields but undermined his and other farmers' health. Now he has returned to organic ways and recovered his well-being. Pesticide misuse is an example of how economic success damaged the environment. Protests began with the mid-1980s anti-nuclear movements.
其实最早的时候，那个时候还有这个戒严嘛，还是在戒严，所以环境运动其实是突破戒严最早的社会运动。因为对于执政者来讲，民众要求一个安全健康的环境，你去打压这个理由不合理嘛哈，所以最早的时候就从反对运动是从环境运动开始，所以反对党其实早期都是参与环境运动的人，除了反核运动，还有一些反公害、反污染啊，等等的运动，其实大家都是一起的。
Taiwan has 4 nuclear power plants, but only one is in active use.
最大的问题是怎么样处理核废料的问题。不过目前的情势看起来，大家都不希望处理这个问题，就不谈了。
While nuclear waste festers in the cooling pools, industrial pollution was until recently accepted as a necessary trade-off for economic growth. Now, that idea is being questioned. I visited a Formosa Plastics site in the industrial city of Kaohsiung, where the PVC petrochemical plant assaulted us with its foul fumes. Earlier, campaigners exposed spills of chlorine and mercury into the groundwater used by locals for cooking.
这个工厂又发生一个很严重的污染，就是这是大家比较熟悉，就2009年的时候。那但是这个事件就是这个工厂被环保局就是环保署就是进场去调查的时候，发现它的地下水中的这个污染有一个污染物叫做122氯乙烷呢，它竟然超过法规标准302000倍。
就是工业快速的扩张，那人民还有政府也都在这边在追求经济的成长，那所以会带来一些这种环境跟社会的后果啊。
I met a man who led the fight back over 25 years of protest.
我是在地后进的人，我们在这边是民国76年反对中国石油，他要建5氢的厂。当时还没有建5氢以前，污染就非常严重，我们在这边民不聊生。
这么严重？你举个例子。
它严重就是说污染它的水啦，地下水，它地下水抽起来，点火会着火了，会爆炸。我们整个运动讲起来，我们是算成功的了。全台湾呢，我们第一个赶走国营事业的了。
Life goes on. In a Taipei shopping center, young and old find moments of happiness in the simple pleasure of riding round and round and round. Here on a hillside above Luye, near Taidong, on the east coast, the indigenous Bunan community introduces tourists to nature with a short hike through what they call the forest bank, where you nurture natural wealth with withdrawals and deposits. It puts a fun face on indigenous people's closeness to the land. With no tacky souvenirs in sight, the community wins visitors with mochi making. There is a traditional lunch, and at the end, everyone plants a tree.
这个地方就是20年前有财团有钱人要把这个森林这些土地森林要买下来。因为以前我是做过记者，那看过很多原住民的地方，台湾的原住民的地方， 很多的森林、土地、温泉，都被政府、被财团掌握。再来就是，我也看过很多的原住民的社区部落，都是被政府帮忙，协助、越辅导、越很多都倒下来，发展观光都被脱光光，土地都没有了，部落的发展的主导权不在我们手上。我说这个地方不要，在我们部落发生，我到处借钱，用自己的房子、土地向银行抵押贷款。抢救这个森林，留住这个土地，要留给我们下一代。
For him, these are ancestral lands, and many have been taken away or made into national parks. The indigenous communities want them back, but the government is not budging. This is a sore spot with the indigenous peoples. Their lives are now typically much like other residents of Taiwan, but they have many unique historical injustices to face and continue to fight for their rights. An environmental campaigner gives her take.
然后这中间还有一个关键是原住民啦，对，就是过去从日本到国民政府来台湾初期，都没有把原住民当成人来看待，他们都是动物，对，然后他们的权利都不是重要。所有受灾的地方、停电的地方、淹水、土石流的地方，全部都是部落。为什么是这样子？是因为安全的地方已经被其他人先选完了的地方，所以台湾的原住民在这100年的过程里面，其实是从在山里面打猎、采集、农耕，到完全没办法做这些事情，所以这些部落的居民，他们在这样的背景下，其实变成台湾的有点像次等公民的。
A man from the Ami, one of Taiwan's 16 officially recognized indigenous groups, describes what it was like at school growing up in the eastern town of Hualien. Discrimination took a toll.
老师只要提到部落的事情啊，或是原住民的事情啊，都好像没有一个是正向的 positive 的。然后我们看电视的时候啊，只要提到原住民，也没有一件事好的。可是，可能有1000个汉人爸爸他不会讲说这些人是汉人，所以我们只要听到媒体里面提到的原住民，都很像都是需要被帮助的。
He felt isolated, but by the mid-1990s, when he attended university, things had begun to change.
所以我说我从花莲来的时候，就有同学说：“你是不是山地的？”因为他们可能认为东部、花莲、台东应该住的都是原住民。可是我要回答这个问题不容易，可是我又不能骗你，可是我要说是，我藏了那么久，可是我试图要藏它，可是我现在又要告诉你是的时候，其实是很难说出来的。可是最后还是说出来，可是是一个很没有自信的去说出来我是谁。对，那一直到了开始进到原住民社团，参与原住民的议题的讨论，参与自己的重新再学习自己的文化，那才开始慢慢把自己跟身份之间的关系做了一些修正，开始做修正。
Taiwan schools now actively promote the diversity of all the local cultures. We observed a celebration of the achievements of the indigenous students at a school in Geelong. The local languages, indigenous tongues, Minnan and Hakka, are now taught at schools alongside Mandarin Chinese, albeit typically only for an hour a week. Without languages, what do we miss? This Hakka broadcaster is clear.
就没有自己的，我会不知道我是谁，对，那我是谁？那我好像没有根，就是你可以做出来，我不知道我从哪里来。我觉得我们都应该要去保有我们原本拥有的那个东西，那代表着是我们，那是代表着我们的东西。 但是如果说大家在沟通上面需要找到一个共通的语言的话，这件事情是没有问题的。你可以说你的母语，我可以说我的母语。可是如果我们必须要 communicate， 我们可以找出一个我们共同的语言，这是 OK 的。
The loss of culture saddens many who feel that more could be done, but support comes from many places, even behind the scenes at the museum.
I'm Phaedra Pham. I'm one of the curators of National Taiwan Museum. We've been inviting indigenous populations into our storage, co-interpret the artifacts, and co-curate the exhibitions together.
I see.
Eventually, these exhibitions can not only be displayed in our museum, but also in their local museums as a way to return home for these artifacts. And also, it can be touring around the world to promote their own culture.
On the whole, help comes too little and too late. But in Taidong, the principal of a mainly indigenous 120-pupil elementary school sees hope.
我觉得这一代的孩子啊，都比较相信自己的这些文化很重要，因为国家开始重视了，然后父母亲这一辈也其实都认为自己的语言跟文化很重要，所以很多这样的工作就被慢慢被做起来，而且越来越多人重视，所以我是觉得这一代的孩子，基本上他比较愿意承认，而且愿意重视自己的语言跟文化，只是在语言的部分，在传承上哈，我觉得比较多的困难。
The Forest Museum founder invited us to his daughter's traditional Bunan wedding. It was a joyful feast, a solemn ceremonial melding of families, and a big giveaway of freshly slaughtered pigs.
Boy, 所以那个时候对我是很冲击的啦，是蛮冲击的。然后我发现我学校教育我的历史，并没有让我对我自己的家人更了解。
After the end of martial law, like something out of George Orwell's 1984 in reverse, this rock band musician turned politician discovered the historical falsehoods he had been taught. Like many others, he had to take a fresh look at national identity and where Taiwan was headed. The island's politics will have a lot to do with the way things play out globally. He sees Taiwan politics as deeply divided.
就一个基本的一个原则的题目，大概就是对中国的关系，你的态度是什么？你是比较亲中，还是你比较站在守护台湾，确保台湾的主权的这个立场？大概是以这两个立场作为主要的。人民会以这两个立场作为主要决定的原则吧。
This makes Taiwan national politics different from typical politics split along a left-right spectrum. Under democracy, powers passed peacefully between the KMT, the blue camp, and the Greens, mainly the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, and recently the blue-leaning Taiwan People's Party, or the TPP. What differentiates the parties is more their ideas on China than domestic issues. But Lim, who is an independent but closely allied with the Green camp, trusts voters share some underlying values.
人民可以支持国民党，但是你必须要维护台湾的主权，让台湾能够不要完全陷入中国的陷阱里面。所以我觉得，因为这个大概是台湾人民的最大的共识啦。不管你说你是支持中华民国还是台湾，但维护我们现在有的一个自由的、独立的生活，这个是人民不用讲出来，但心里大概有一个底线。
But how to avoid what Lim calls China's trap is the source of contention. The Chinese Communist Party says it aims to achieve what it calls reunification, though it has never actually ruled Taiwan. It says it hopes to do this peacefully, which means with incentives and coercion. But if that fails, it vows to use force. In response, the ruling DPP, which first won power for the Green Camp in 2000, opposes unification and favors Taiwan's sovereignty, and in principle independence. But it says declaring independence is unnecessary because Taiwan is already effectively independent. The Blue Camp, mainly the KMT, promotes a Chinese national identity for Taiwan and pushes for democratization in China. The party can be ambiguous about sovereignty, but opposes independence and favors unification. Most people want neither. They want to keep the status quo.
To make it simple, SQ, status quo, means right now. Right now is a democratic government. We have a right to choose a president. We have a market economy. We have a freedom. We have human rights. That's status quo.
Beijing favors the KMT and puts pressure on Taiwan, but the independence aspiration, or at least effective independence, that is, the status quo, remains more popular. In 2024, the DPP won an unprecedented third term as voters opted for the Harvard-educated President Lai Ching-te, who once called himself a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. Lai has since tempered his views, but maintains ROC Taiwan, as he calls it, is sovereign and not part of China. That's enough to attract Beijing's ire. The ancient art of Tai Chi, performed under the banyan trees in the 228 Peace Park, is all about patience, a virtue much extolled in Chinese and Taiwanese traditions. Chinese President Xi Jinping insists unification is, in his words, inevitable and cannot be passed on to the future generations. His words are backed by a massive military buildup and by saber rattling. Practically every day, Beijing sends its fighter jets and warships skirting close to Taiwan. People on the island have become inured to such bluster, but the threat is real. According to U.S. intelligence, China would be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, but invading, or hybrid strategies such as a blockade, pose challenges much, much greater than the Russians faced in moving overland into Ukraine. For one, Chinese forces would have to cross the 160-kilometer-wide Taiwan Strait, known for its rough seas, in the face of what could be determined resistance. This makes invasion extremely risky, costly, and liable to failure. But the main reason China hesitates is that Taiwan has U.S. backing. A big part of Chinese military timing, therefore, will depend on what it thinks the U.S. is willing to do. Taiwan, with forces just a tenth as big as China's, can only fend off invasion until U.S. forces come to its aid. It has no official promises for help, but President Biden and many in Congress say the U.S. will step up. For now, China presses its aims by isolating Taiwan diplomatically and using the carrot and stick to win or compel Taiwan's capitulation. But in this hearts and minds contest, China is its own worst enemy. By crushing demands for democracy inside China and in Hong Kong, by suppressing the Uyghurs and Tibetans, Beijing increasingly alienates Taiwan. The people there may suffer their own doubt and division, but Taiwan is actively boosting its military, its civil preparedness, and global profile. Most critically, observing the war in Ukraine, seeing a small country fend off Russian aggression, has given Taiwan hope. I came to Taiwan in the 1970s, a clueless youth straight out of college, finding a frontier land full of anti-communist rage. I came back in the 1990s with a journalist's eye. Taiwan served up unbounded energy and rapid growth laced with undertows of the recent past. I returned 30 years later, after years as a foreign correspondent in Asia and Europe. I found a place that had come into its own, where democracy was in full flower, and people trusted one another and defended their freedoms. At first it was hard to believe, but sometimes and some places do allow people to be all they can be. And Taiwan today is the closest I have seen anywhere giving that to its citizens. It does what nations are supposed to do. Why is Taiwan undaunted? I saw people taking the future in their own hands, acting with tolerance to others, and living life to the fullest, despite everything.